So welcome back. The question that we had yesterday was twofold. The first was, what is the question in chapter 6, verse 1 that is then answered, and how is it answered in the following verses all the way to chapter 6, verse 14? And then also, what specifically does it mean to consider ourselves dead to sin? But let's start again with this map, and let's look at, remind ourselves that whereas here the diagnosis of sin was long, remember it took chapters 1 to 3, and here the diagnosis is very short. It was really just chapter 5, verses 12 to 14. So it's fairly short diagnosis of the problem of sin. When you get to the solution to the salvation, it's reversed. Here, it was really just in chapter 3, in the middle of it, that you get the announcement and sort of the mechanism of salvation, how to become justified. Sorry, it's a mess here, but that's the word there, justified. And here, as we begin to talk about sanctification, we're going to find it's not just sort of in the middle of chapter 5 or the beginning of chapter 6, but rather it's going to be chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8. So here it's going to be long. So you see the pattern? Here it was a long diagnosis of sin and a short announcement about the mechanism of salvation. Here it's a short diagnosis of the problem of sin and a long discussion about the mechanism of salvation. And one of the reasons that's important is because as you get through chapters 6, 7, and 8, where it's so relevant to our daily life, how do we personally overcome the power of sin in our daily lives and live holy lives, walk in holiness, in righteousness, practically? There's going to be some layers to that. It's not just one simple answer right off the top about the mechanism for that. And secondly, it means that as Paul analyzes the question and begins to provide the different mechanisms, that it's a little bit like an old car manual. If you had to remove the starter from an engine in 1980 Honda Accord, you'd buy these thick manuals, and as you go to look at how to remove the starter, they would give you step-by-step instructions, and they would have, say, 4 or 5 photographs of the engine, so you knew which parts to remove and so on. But the problem was, when you would look at those photographs, it sometimes didn't look exactly like your engine, and the reason is because they would remove obstructions so that the photograph was clearer. So they would remove other parts of the engine to make the photograph clearer, so that as you were looking at the problem you had to address, so they could focus just on that one problem, they would remove other things out of the way so you could see them. But of course that meant, in a sense, that the photographs were representing an engine that never existed exactly as you saw in the photograph. So as you go through this section here, chapters 6 through 8, we have to remember that Paul is going to do a sort of similar thing. He's going to look at isolated problems. They all relate to one another, of course. They're all in the same engine, so to speak, of our soul and of our bodies and our minds. But he will look at them sort of in isolation. And so as he progresses, you have to realize that some parts are left out in order to be addressed later. So I'll remind you of that here and there, but that's a real key part to understanding the sort of the progression of his argument. All right, so what's the question? Well, the question is pretty straightforward. Are we to continue in sin? Right? He has just said that where sin, that if you have the law present, that causes sin to magnify it. It increases the trespass. But grace abounds all the more where the trespass has increased. So should we then, on that basis, continue in sin that grace may abound? So as we sin, God's grace just gets greater and greater. And of course the answer is that's ridiculous. That's definitely not God's goal, is for us just to keep sinning so that his grace will keep increasing. So what's the gist of the answer? The gist of the answer is that we have died. We have died. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that the Bill Wortman who lived up until I was, about 20 years old, that my record of the record of my life was erased, was deleted, as if no differently as if my life was over. As far as heaven is concerned, I died. That's exactly what our baptism into Christ signified. That we have died in Christ. Our life, the record of our life anyway, is over. And we are now going to start anew. We are raised also. Christ was raised, and we too are to walk in newness of life. We now walk with a new life. All right, so it wouldn't make sense if we had a new life that we wouldn't live the new life. So what does he mean then when he says to consider yourselves dead to sin? Well, the key here is to see that he's analogizing our new life with Christ and our death with Christ. We know, verse 9, that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. For the death he died to sin, once for all. But the life he lives to God. So, now that word so means in the same way. In the same way, you also must consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God. And what does he mean in the same way? Well, he means in the same way that Christ, redo that, in the same way that Christ died to sin. You see that little phrase there? Died to sin. And we're to consider ourselves dead to sin. You see, it's the same idea. So in what sense did Jesus die to sin? There's two ways to think of that. Well, let's just think of the first one. One is that Jesus was so tempted by sin, he was so overwhelmed by the temptation of sin that he was just put to death so he didn't have to endure temptation anymore. Is that what it meant that Jesus died on the cross? Of course not. It's not talking about his temptation to sin, his desire to sin. No, he died to sin in that he died. The death he died to sin. The death he died, you see? The death he died. He died to sin in that he died. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you lived under the law, you knew that meant that God commanded you to do something or you died. If you failed to keep the law, then the law would lead to death. You would die. And then once you died, as far as the law was concerned, you were free from the law because you had fulfilled the requirements of the law. So everyone who had died had paid the punishment, the penalty of the law. So in other words, the law of Moses was a command followed by a penalty, or it could be a prohibition followed by a penalty. And the penalty, the ultimate penalty, was death. So when Jesus died, his death was fulfilling the penalty for the law. And Paul is telling us here in verses 10 and 11 that just as Jesus' death was fulfilling the penalty for sin under the law, in the same way we should consider ourselves dead to sin. In other words, we are free from the penalty of the law. We're free from death. So look at this little expression here in verse 4. One who has died has been set free from sin, meaning from sin's penalty. We are no longer under the law. We're free from the penalty. Why would that all be important for our holiness? Well, because if you lived under the law and you were going to say, today, set out to live a holy life. So let's say I got out of bed and I'm going to try and live a holy life. Well, how long do you think I'm going to make it before I sin. It's not going to take very long before I sin. And once I sin, I'm at that point under the penalty of death if I live under the law. So there's no way to make progress in holiness, because by sinning the first time, I'm under the penalty of death, subpoena mortis. So I need to get out from under the law so that when I sin, I'm not immediately condemned to death. So this whole argument, chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. Why I cannot write sometimes on my iPad, is arguing that we are not anymore under the law. Okay? Which is why he says here, sin shall not, or let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body. Here's the line. For sin shall have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. All right, so we're no longer going to face the penalty of sin because we're not under law. This is step 1 in our sanctification. All right, step 1. If you want to truly become holy, you have to get out from under the law, not under the law. Okay, and then we can finally begin to make progress in holiness. So that brings us to our next question, verse 15. What is the question here in verse 15? And then how is it answered in what follows? But keep in mind, there are 2 parts to the answer. Part 1 is here in verses 15 to 23, and then part 2 is here in verses 1 to 6 in chapter 7, because after that, right, you get the next question here. So keep that in mind. It's all of that section. There's part 1 here. All this is part 1. That's part 2, chapter 7, verses 1 to 6. And then all this up here is part 1. So 2 parts. So what are the 2 parts? They're different aspects to one question. So 2 different parts to the answer to one question. So best wishes, and we'll see you next time.